had 12 years in the nursing profession, most of that in high-volume trauma centers, which gave me a functional skepticism about anything that couldn't be verified through clinical data or direct observation. I was not the kind of woman who saw visions. I was not the kind of person who talked about them afterward. My grandmother used to say that some things are meant for the spirit and some for the world, and I kept them strictly separate. What I am about to tell you is not a comfort. It is not the kind of near-death story where someone floats through a warm tunnel and returns with a vague sense that love is the answer. What I was shown was operational intelligence about something already in motion, with specific dates, specific mechanisms, and a specific warning about a choice that every person alive right now is going to be forced to make, whether they understand that or not. I am telling you this because I was instructed to. I'm telling you this because the timeline is not distant. And I'm telling you this because some of you already know something is wrong. You just haven't been able to name it yet. I'll name it for you. Just 6 days ago, I was in my garden in Atlanta. It was a Saturday morning, a rare day off from the hospital. I was kneeling in the dirt, working on the hydrangeas, when my heart simply stopped. There was no warning, no chest pain, just a sudden, total disconnect. I collapsed right there among the rows of greens. My neighbor, who happens to be an EMT, saw me go down and reached me in seconds. He later told my husband, Malik, that he found me without a pulse and non-responsive. The paramedics worked on me for what felt like an eternity on the way to the very hospital where I work. The surgical team and the cardiologists I've shared coffee with for years worked for over 9 minutes before my heart finally caught a rhythm again. The attending physician told Malik that the duration of oxygen deprivation was incompatible with consciousness, let alone survival, and that the next 72 hours would determine whether we were talking about recovery or something else. None of that is the story. The story is what happened in those 9 minutes. My heart was not beating. I was above my garden before I understood I had left my body. I could see my neighbor performing compressions below me, see the garden hose still running, see the traffic moving on the street nearby. I was not frightened. That absence of fear was the first indication that something categorically different was happening. As a nurse, I've seen fear in 1,000 forms: the sharp panic of a trauma patient, the slow dread in an oncology ward. I understood fear as a diagnostic tool, a piece of information. This was not the absence of danger. It was a quality of certainty that had no equivalent in anything I had previously experienced. The light was not like sunlight. I want to be precise about this because the word light is inadequate. It was present the way a commanding presence is present in a room before anyone has spoken. You simply become aware of it as the organizing principle of everything around you. I moved toward it without effort. Then I was somewhere else entirely. I was standing on ground that felt solid under my feet, but looked like nothing geological. There was sky, distance, and a horizon. The architecture of the place obeyed the rules of space without obeying any specific physical law I could identify. I was still in my gardening clothes, still had the red Georgia clay under my fingernails. I registered those details the way you register vitals during a code, sharply, precisely, because your training is trying to orient you in an unfamiliar environment, and it reaches for what it knows. He was walking toward me from across that impossible terrain, and I recognized him before any conscious identification occurred. It was recognition at the level of structure, the way your body recognizes gravity. This was not the imagery from chapel services. This was authority that made every chief of medicine or high-ranking official I've ever served under look like they were rehearsing for a role they didn't fully understand. I came to something close to attention without deciding to. He said, "My name, Jasmine," and the way he said it told me he had always known it. "I don't have much time to give you a long orientation," he said. And the directness of it oriented me faster than any elaborate introduction could have. What I'm going to show you is not for you alone. Your background is the reason you're standing here. 12 years of triage, assessing threats, following orders in high-pressure environments, and recognizing the signs of a body under attack. You're going to need all of it to understand what I'm about to show you and to report it accurately when you get back. He did not say, "if I get back." He said, "when." He didn't waste words with a long explanation of the afterlife or the mysteries of the universe. Instead, He began to pull back the curtain on the world we currently inhabit. I was shown the world not as we see it through our phone screens or the evening news, but as a vast, interconnected machine that has been built right under our noses. As a nurse, I've always understood how a hospital functions: the supply chain for bandages, the way the power grid keeps the ventilators humming, the complex records of every patient. What he showed me was that the entire world had been organized into a similar system, but the purpose wasn't healing. I saw the architecture of the technology first. It wasn't one single invention that appeared out of nowhere. It was a slow, methodical gathering of pieces. I saw the faces of engineers in sleek offices and CEOs in boardrooms, and for the most part, they weren't villains in a movie. They were people who thought they were solving problems. They were building ways to pay for groceries with a wave of a hand to save time. They were designing systems to track heart rates and blood sugar levels in real time to save lives. They were creating digital IDs to prevent fraud and protect our identities. Each piece was sold to the public as a solution to a specific inconvenience or a specific fear. But then the view shifted, and I saw how these separate pieces were being woven together into a single net. He showed me that the integration of these technologies, the health trackers, the digital wallets, the social media profiles, the biometric records, was already complete. The net was already cast. It just hadn't been pulled tight yet. The center of this net was the device itself. It was so small it was almost offensive, no bigger than a grain of rice. I watched as it was demonstrated in a setting that looked like a high-end medical clinic. It wasn't a surgery. It was an injection, quick and painless, the kind of thing I've done 10,000 times with a flu shot. I saw the way it sat under the skin, invisible to the eye but constantly communicating with the world around it. It wasn't just a chip, it was a bridge. It linked the physical body of the person to the vast digital architecture of the world. Then the scene changed, and I was shown the why. He showed me that the people who run this world know that most people won't accept something like this during normal times. People value their privacy too much when things are going well. To get the world to accept the net, the world had to be broken. I saw the month of April 2026. It started with a series of ripples that quickly turned into a flood. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was a sequence of events that looked like a series of accidents, but was actually a controlled demolition of the systems we rely on to live. I saw the screens in the financial centers go dark, not all at once, but in a way that created a panic that fed on itself. People went to ATMs and found they couldn't get their money. They went to grocery stores and their cards were declined. This wasn't because the money was gone, but because the system used to verify the transaction was under attack. I saw the power grids in major cities begin to flicker and fail. I saw the logistics chains, the trucks that bring the food I see in the Atlanta markets every day, stalled on the side of the road because their routing systems were compromised. I saw the hospitals, the places where I've spent my life, struggling to function because their digital records were locked behind a wall they couldn't climb. The brilliance of the plan was that it was designed to look like it was coming from an outside enemy. I saw the news reports, the frantic anchors talking about cyber warfare and foreign hackers. The evidence was there, planted deep in the code, designed to be found by investigators who were looking for a reason to explain the chaos. The public would be given a face to hate and a reason to be afraid. And in that fear, they would stop asking questions about how the solution appeared so quickly. Within days, the solution was offered. It was presented not as a new law, but as a restoration of service. The leaders appeared on every screen that was still working, their voices calm and reassuring. They talked about the emergency identity and health protocol. They said the old systems were too vulnerable, too easy to hack, and that physical documents like passports and plastic cards were a thing of the past. They offered the implant as the only way to be secure. He showed me the rollout in 3 distinct movements. The first was purely voluntary, and it was framed as an act of wisdom and even an act of love for one's neighbor. If you got the implant, you were verified. You got immediate access to your funds. You got a green light at the grocery store. You were moved to the front of the line at the clinics. I saw people I recognized, people who looked like the patients I see every day, lining up for it because they were tired of being hungry, tired of being afraid, and they just wanted their lives back. It didn't look like a religious choice. It looked like a practical one. In the second movement, the pressure began to change from an invitation to a requirement. I saw businesses being told that to remain secure, they could only hire verified employees. I saw schools saying that for the safety of the children, every parent and student needed the link. I saw the healthcare system, my own world, being restructured so that if you weren't on the system, you were an anonymous patient. And the friction of trying to get care without verification became so great that people felt they had no choice. The third movement was the closing of the trap. I saw a world where if you weren't in the system, you simply didn't exist in the eyes of society. You couldn't buy a bus ticket. You couldn't enter a government building. You couldn't even pay your utility bills. It wasn't that it was illegal to be without it. It was just practically impossible to survive within the walls of the city without it. But then he took me deeper. He showed me that the implant wasn't the end of the story. It was the delivery system for something much more permanent. He showed me how the device would be updated. Just like the phones we all carry, the technology would evolve. The first version was for money and ID. The second was for health monitoring. But the third was for stability. I was shown the human brain, not as a textbook diagram, but as a living, breathing landscape of energy and chemicals. He showed me how the third generation of this technology would begin to interface with the very chemistry of who we are. It wasn't a sudden takeover. It was a subtle, constant nudge. I saw the way it would dampen the feelings of unrest, the very feelings that lead a person to pray or to seek God. I saw the way it would smooth over the sharp edges of the soul so that people felt a constant, artificial sense of well-being. He showed me a woman who had received this update. She was sitting in a church, singing songs, and listening to a sermon. She looked perfectly normal. But inside, the place where the spirit speaks to the heart was being muffled. It was like a thick blanket had been thrown over her conscience. She could hear the words, but she couldn't feel the weight of them. She was fine, but she was no longer free. This is the transition, he said to me. The point where the technology becomes a cage for the spirit. They will not feel it happen. They will think they are just becoming more balanced, more at peace, but they are being separated from the frequency of my voice. I stood there on that ground that wasn't ground, and for the first time, I felt a shadow of the fear I had lost. I realized that the people I work with, the people I love in Atlanta, were walking right into a trap that had been laid out with the precision of a surgical strike. I asked him why he was telling me this specifically. I already understood part of the answer from what he had said earlier, but as someone who spent her life working in the systems of this world, I needed to understand the logic of the message. I wanted to know why a nurse from Georgia was being handed what felt like a high-level military briefing. Because the people who need to hear this warning are not all in the pews, he said. And his voice carried a weight that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my feet. Some of them are, but some of them have walked away from houses of worship that felt hollow. And they were right. Those places were hollow. They were building social clubs while the storm was gathering on the horizon. Those people are never going to receive this from an institutional source. They've lost their appetite for the performances. He showed me a vision of people I recognized by their spirit, if not their faces. They were military members, first responders, nurses, and doctors. People whose entire professional life is built around looking at a situation, assessing the threat, and executing a mission. These are people who don't have time for fluff. They deal in the reality of the pulse, the breath, and the hard facts of survival. For those people, a message delivered in the flowery language of traditional religion often feels like a distraction. It doesn't penetrate the armor they've had to build to do their jobs. But operational intelligence, specific information about a threat, and a timeline delivered by someone who understands the stakes, that is something they can process. I use the right messenger for the specific people I'm trying to reach, he said. Then he showed me the people who would actually receive the warning. And this was the part I carried back with the most weight. It changed how I understood my own neighborhood in Atlanta. The people who would hear this were not distinguished by how much they knew about theology or how many verses they could quote. Some of them had almost no formal religious education at all. Some had been away from a church building for 20 years. What they had in common was a single structural quality. They had maintained an actual listening relationship with God that existed outside of any building or organization. The Holy Spirit had already been moving in them for months before I ever collapsed in my garden. He showed me a woman in the Midwest who had already begun quietly stocking up on medicine and supplies, even though her husband thought she was being paranoid. She couldn't explain why she was doing it. She just knew she had to. I saw a retired officer in a rural area who had been moving his resources into land and tools for months, telling his family it was just a gut feeling. I saw groups of young people in cities who had started meeting in living rooms, not to have a social hour, but because their regular communities felt like they were preparing them for comfort, and their spirits were telling them they needed to prepare for cost. These people were already experiencing a specific kind of restlessness, a sense that the floor was about to drop out, and they weren't positioned correctly. He showed me that my testimony wasn't meant to convince the skeptics or argue with the scoffers. Its function was to validate and release the belief that was already present in these people. It was a confirmation for the ones who were already questioning their own sanity because of the nudge they were feeling. It was meant to give them permission to act on convictions they had been suppressing because they didn't want to look irrational to their neighbors. Focus on these people, he told me, not because the others don't matter, but because this is where the message will bear fruit. The ones who have already decided that their personal comfort is the highest priority have already made their choice. You cannot unmake that decision for them. You've worked enough codes to know that you can't save a patient who doesn't have the will to fight. Then he began to give me practical instructions for the time before the April crisis hits. It was like a checklist for a disaster response plan. He told me that the people who hear this need to move away from high-density population centers, especially the major coastal cities. These are the places where the first phase of the disruption will be the most acute, where the systems of control will be applied with the most pressure. He spoke about food and water security that doesn't depend on a grocery store or a municipal pipe. He spoke about building relationships with a small number of other people who were similarly positioned, not large, organized movements that attract attention and are easily broken, but small networks of genuine trust. He emphasized the need for communication systems that don't rely on the internet. He told me people needed to get out of financial positions that depended on the stability of the very systems that were about to be deliberately taken down. None of this was about being a prepper in the way the world thinks of it. It was about being positioned. He used the analogy of a medical team being in the right place before a mass casualty event happens. If you're in the right place with the right tools, you can function. If you're caught in the middle of the chaos without a plan, you're just another casualty. Then he showed me the communities that would form among the people who refused the mark. This was the most beautiful and the most challenging thing I saw. These communities didn't look like anything I had imagined. They weren't built on whether people agreed on every small point of doctrine. I saw people who had spent their whole lives in different traditions, people who would have argued for hours about the details of the end times or the way to perform a ceremony, sitting at the same table because they realized they were part of the same body. They were organized around function. I saw a nurse like me teaching others how to manage infections without a hospital. I saw farmers teaching city people how to grow what they needed. I saw older people teaching the young how to endure. There was a radical generosity that felt like it had been pulled straight out of the early accounts of the followers of Jesus. They shared resources, they shared knowledge, and they shared the cost of their choices. The church I am building does not look like any institution currently operating. It looks like the reality of my spirit, living through people who have lost what the world values in order to hold on to what I value. The conditions coming will simply burn away the wood, hay, and stubble until only the real thing is left. Then he told me it was time for me to go back. I felt a weight of sadness because the peace of that place was so much more real than the air in Atlanta. But he placed his hand against my chest, right where my heart had stopped. I felt a change in that spot, deep in the bone and the spirit. He told me that when I got back, the world would try to tell me I was crazy. He told me my own mind would try to convince me it was all a dream or a trick of a dying brain. When you doubt, he said, feel this place. It isn't a feeling you have to manufacture. It is a presence, a pulse point that will be there as long as your heart beats. It will answer the doubt without you having to say a word. He gave me one final instruction. Deliver the warning before the crisis makes people afraid. Fear narrows the vision. It makes people grab for the first solution offered. But clarity allows for a choice. The return was like being dropped from a great height. One moment I was in that vast, living light, and the next I was slammed back into the density of my own broken body. The pain was like a wall of sound. Every nerve was screaming. I could taste the metallic tang of blood and the plastic of the tube in my throat. I heard the frantic, rhythmic chirping of the monitors, the sound I had heard in 1,000 other rooms, but never for myself. I opened my eyes to the white glare of the ICU. My friend and colleague, a doctor I've worked with for years, was leaning over me. I saw the moment his professional face cracked, and he realized I was looking back at him. I couldn't speak, but I reached out and squeezed his hand with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. The days that followed were a blur of tests and questions. They told me my heart had been stopped for 9 minutes. They told me that with that kind of time, I should have severe brain damage. They looked at my scans and my labs, and they couldn't find a reason why I was sitting up and asking for a pen and paper. I didn't try to explain it to them then. I just felt that warm, steady pulse in the center of my chest, exactly where he had touched me. I'm grateful you stayed and listened to my story. If you're still here, maybe this message reached you for a reason. Before you leave, write in the comments where you're watching from, so I can keep you and your nation in my prayers. If this testimony meant something to you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next messages. And please share this with a few people you care about. Sometimes a single story can open a heart and lead someone back to God.